You know, Hansel, I feel pretty crummy.
On Halloween night, 1983, the Disney Channel premiered one of the darkest, creepiest, and most uncomfortable programs that the network had ever broadcast before. It had everything you could ask for from a Disney project. A fresh take on a classic fairy tale, a evil stepmother, and even a wicked witch. The thing was, the person tasked with combining all of these ingredients was a young and frustrated Tim Burton, who was eager to put his brand of gothic surrealism on display. Was Disney pleased with what they got? And what exactly happened that led to them firing Burton and burying his film in the vault for over 25 years? Well, today we find out as we rediscover the story behind Tim Burton's first live-action film, Hansel and Gretel. Wait, was that witch using nunchucks? Yeah, this one's gonna get wild.
Finish me! Finish me! Open the hanger.
I'm pretty sure that it's gonna surprise nobody that Tim Burton hasn't always fit the standard mold, in Hollywood or just in general. Sure, you can argue that over time his style has softened somewhat and he's now just as part of the mainstream pop culture as anything else. But in those early years, this was not the case. Tim Burton was considered really, really strange.
Hi, Tim.
This is Tim Burton. Another one of our people here. Isn't he a gas?
Tim, you've got such talent.
Moving right along.
And this was even before he got to Disney, where he made, arguably, some of his strangest stuff. But before we get to Hansel and Gretel and everything that comes with it, we've got to rediscover how the creation of such a wild project was even possible.
When you're in pain, you need some sort of release, like drawing, thinking, writing, creating.
Growing up in Burbank, California in the 60s and 70s, Burton realized that he just didn't fit in with most crowds.
In school, nobody seemed to really like me. I don't know. Nobody just seemed to really like me that much, which allowed me to have a lot of free time to kind of wander around in your own head, you know?
And so rather than going out with friends to socialize, monster movies and magazines, his sketchbook and his family's Super 8 film camera quickly became his primary focus.
In school, I wasn't a very good student, so I would make these films, and like I remember I was supposed to read a book on Houdini that was about that, and I was not a reader. Unfortunately, that was the one part of the growing up in this sort of television generation. I didn't read as much as I probably should have or would have liked to have got most of it through film. So I did a little short film, me as Houdini escaping from a train track. So I found it was a great way of getting a good grade and having fun at the same time. So that kind of got me into it, although I never really thought I would ever become doing that. I think I was interested in animation. I think that's where I put my focus early on.
Before too long, Burton's artistic ability and style was getting noticed. He won an anti-litter art contest and had his winning piece attached to all the garbage trucks around town. He also eventually found a small group of like-minded outcast types who would obsess over making movies together. And all of this culminated in him being offered a scholarship to the California Institute of the Arts, a feeder school for Disney animators that had been founded, in part, by Walt and Roy Disney in 1961.
At Cal Arts, the student will be educated in the sciences and humanities, but will spend most of his time in the development of artistic talents. A man who will draw, will draw.
Throughout his time at Cal Arts, Tim once again surrounded himself with like-minded outcasts who were obsessed with film and animation. But even here, his strange depiction of characters and the world around them stood out.
Next, please.
In his junior year, his short film Stalk of the Celery Monster caught the eye of Disney recruiters, who hired Burton as an animator on The Fox and the Hound. Though this did not turn out well.
I was not good at drawing Disney characters. The first film I worked on was called Fox and the Hound. That's where I first did some. Yeah. And all of my foxes looked like they'd been hit by cars. So we took out the roadkill sequence, and none of my work really survived that film.
And to his credit, by the late 70s, early 80s, the Walt Disney Company was starting to feel like maybe wide-eyed talking animals wasn't their style either. Now, I've covered this very strange period of Disney history many times before in my previous videos. But just know that after the death of Walt Disney in the mid-60s, the company spent a whole lot of time trying to figure out its new identity. And by the 80s, the decision had been made to find young new visionaries and let them drive the studio forward. Though, Disney had absolutely no idea what to do with or how to handle these visionaries. This included Tim Burton, who once again found himself feeling like an outcast in his own surroundings.
I think I plunged into a major depression because I was just so bad at it. And I got really depressed. I would sleep at my desk 2 hours in the day, in the morning, at my desk, sitting straight up with the boss on, and then have a 2-hour break at lunch, then sleep 2 hours in the afternoon, then get a good 10 hours sleep at night. So I got definitely stranger when I worked there.
And as soon as you found your way through, that was...
Yeah, as soon as they kind of let me, I think they got kind of afraid of me a bit. And
why was that be?
Well, because they didn't quite know what to do with me.
Just like he had done in high school, Tim linked up with some of the other frustrated young animators around him and experimented with directing his own spoof-style movies, all in his free time.
Bob is a supreme being. I challenge you to a surfing contest.
And when these personal projects of his started to catch the eye of some of the higher-ups, he was moved over to be a concept artist.
I got the opportunity to just draw and do different things, which was a great, it was kind of unheard of. I got to sit in a room for a year, just draw things for Black Cauldron, whatever I wanted to draw, and then once that didn't pan out, I got to draw things for other projects, and none of which really panned out. But even though it was a strange time in the company's history, I got a lot of interesting, strange opportunities to just explore things.
However, these same higher-ups continued to see big potential in Burton and partnered him with sculptor and fellow Cal Arts graduate Rick Heinrichs. The team was given $60,000 to make Vincent, a stop-motion animated short film based on a poem that Burton had written in the style of Dr. Seuss.
Another project that Tim and I worked on together was an experiment with stop-motion animation for which I took Tim's designs and created puppets in three-dimensional sets.
It's basically the story of a little boy who thinks that he's Vincent Price. And it was initially a children's book, but Rick and I made it then into a film. And it comes from my childhood experiences, and as I had sort of a identification, I thought, with Vincent Price, and that I really responded to his torment and anguish and insanity.
And while Disney was pleased with the finished film, nobody quite knew what to do with it. It was submitted to various film festivals where it won accolades and awards and even got a theatrical release, but only for 2 weeks in one Los Angeles theater, where it was bundled with their 1982 teen drama Tex. Not exactly a good fit for audiences.
He likes to experiment on his dog, Abercrombie, in the hopes of creating a horrible zombie.
Well, I take horses real serious.
I hope so, Tex. I hope there's something you take seriously.
Tim Burton found himself in a very strange place with all of this. Creatively, he was completely fulfilled. He had successfully gotten one of his passion projects funded, and the small audience that had seen his on-screen work actually liked it. But once again, he found himself in a situation where Disney just had no idea what to do with him. But luckily for Tim, Disney had a completely separate problem that they needed to solve. They had just launched an entire premium cable channel and were in desperate need of new content. Why not give the generally unproven yet brilliant Tim Burton a check for over $100,000 to make a short made-for-TV fairy tale? What could possibly go wrong?
There's a new character in Hansel and Gretel.
I'm Dan, the gingerbread man, and I'm made entirely out of candy.
From the beginning, Tim Burton's Hansel and Gretel wasn't exactly your usual production. Disney executive Julie Hickson, one of the higher-ups that had seen Tim's potential, signed on to write and produce. She embraced the strange techniques that the Burton and Heinrichs team had been experimenting with, and pushed to have it all incorporated with a cast of live actors. And all of this style and technique would be wrapped around a pretty standard retelling of Hansel and Gretel. Well, pretty standard if what you're looking at is only the text on the page. Everything else is a little more out there. For Tim, it was important to try and capture a kind of Japanese aesthetic as a nod to the early Godzilla films that he had grown up with. And so the small cast consists entirely of Japanese actors, none of which had ever acted professionally before. The character of the father, who, in the original Grimm fairy tale is a woodcutter, is now a toy maker. And so much of the 35-minute movie is filled with these strange and unusual toys, copied almost directly out of Tim's wild sketchbook. And the strange off-kilter design doesn't stop there, because once Hansel and Gretel get lost in the woods and stumble onto the witch in her edible house, things quickly enter into a full-on unfiltered gallery of Tim Burton's imagination. I mean, look at this witch! What would in any other production of Hansel and Gretel be just your standard old hag or some kind of mangled monster, here she looks like something out of a children's nightmare.
My, an apple pie. Who could these two little budgies be? Have they come to stay with me? Hello. Oh, come in, dearies, come in. We don't want you standing outside in the cold doorstep now, do we? Come in and have some candy.
Even the edible candy house is like something out of a horror movie. Again, in any other typical Hansel and Gretel story, the house would be gingerbread or maybe chocolate or something. But in Tim Burton's version, the witch's house has like a candy-frosted skin that's filled with fluids of various colors that apparently taste great. It's all very 1980s David Cronenberg meets The Stuff meets street trash, though it actually predates most of those. Things, though, really kick into high gear when the kids go to bed, and we start seeing many of the Tim Burton design elements that would show up in his later films.
If you play your cards right, you'll be out of there in no time. And besides, you're the guest of honor for dinner tonight, and I know you'll love the menu.
It's also here where we're briefly introduced to Dan the Gingerbread Man, who basically exists only to serenade Hansel with a parody of Rod Stewart's Do You Think I'm Sexy, all in an attempt to be eaten.
Just start with an eeny weeny little bite.
Well, maybe just a taste.
That's it. If you think I'm tasty and you want my body, come on, Hansel, take a bite.
I'm not eating anymore. You're disgusting.
I said take another bite.
Now at this point, I know what you're thinking. How could this thing get any weirder? Well, this is where the kung fu starts. Yeah, Gretel saves Hansel by thwacking the witch with a fire poker. And this kicks off an extended low-rent kung fu-ish fight scene that literally tears the witch's house to the ground in an explosion of neon goop. And this scene wraps with the witch drop kicking herself into the oven that was intended for Hansel. The house completely melts into a large lake of mush, and the toy swan that was given to them by their father earlier in the movie magically emerges from underneath. The swan has, for some reason, grown large enough to take them back home, where their father is waiting to tell Hansel and Gretel that the evil stepmother is now gone and all is well, especially once the swan also vomits out a large quantity of gold coins. And that's a wrap for Tim Burton's Hansel and Gretel. The whole thing is a strange deep dive into some wild experimental concepts and design and techniques that just don't quite gel into a cohesive vision. This includes the soundtrack, which was composed and performed by jazz pianist John Costa, whose name you probably don't recognize, but anyone that watched Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood has definitely heard his music.
It's such a good feeling to know you're in tune.
His soft and sweet soundtrack kind of floats throughout Hansel and Gretel, which makes everything feel kind of like a lucid dream. It kind of works at points, but also feels out of place once the action ramps up.
I'm back here and that's a little air, they're mine. Mine for breakfast, lunch, dinner, and dessert.
Tim wasn't entirely pleased with the finished product either, feeling like it came off as rather cheap and amateurish. And when the team finally screened the special for Disney Channel executives, whatever they were expecting, it was pretty clear this wasn't it. And Tim Burton quickly found himself, once again, with another creative project on his hands that the studio had no idea what to do with. And while it did technically make it to the Disney Channel, Hansel and Gretel ended up being bundled with Burton's earlier film Vincent and aired at 10:30 p.m. on October 29, 1983 as a 1-hour special hosted by none other than Vincent Price. It was then buried deep within Disney's vault and actually thought to be completely lost, until a copy shockingly showed up at the Museum of Modern Art Traveling Tim Burton exhibition in 2009, and then on YouTube later in 2014. Though an even better and more complete version was eventually uploaded to audio sweetener Bill Gazecki's Vimeo channel in 2021. Hansel and Gretel wasn't quite the end of Tim Burton's initial stint at Disney. Julie Hickson continued to champion his potential and was able to convince the other higher-ups to give Tim Burton one final chance. In 1984, the studio gave Burton close to $1 million to bring his own personal Frankenstein story to the screen with Frankenweenie. The 30-minute short would feature a misunderstood young boy attempting to make his way through suburbia with the help of his own passion for home movie making and the love of his dog Sparky. When Sparky is hit by a car, though, the boy does his best Dr. Frankenstein impression and brings him back from the dead. The final short film ended up being about as nice of a balance of Tim Burton's strangeness and Disney storytelling as you could possibly hope for at the time. It had its darker moments, sure, but it also showed a level of restraint that we hadn't seen from earlier Burton projects. It was also a love story, and not just one about a boy and his dog, or even Tim's own affection for classic horror movies. It was a tale about growing up while not fitting in, about seeking comfort and safety in your own passions, and about not letting go of what you love, no matter how strange and unusual those around you may find it. It was clearly a deeply personal film, one that Disney was sure to appreciate and give the mainstream push Tim had been waiting for, right? Well, any hope for that was dashed once the MPAA rating board got a hold of it and gave it a PG rating, meaning that the studio could no longer attach it to one of their other films.
They had the idea at the time to do like a featurette, which they used to do in the old days before they'd show before like an animated film, because animated films were short. They'd do like, the crazy cougar that goes to Hollywood, or some kind of nature short. So they said, well, why, gave me the opportunity to say, we'll release this in front of Pinocchio, but it kind of freaked people out, so they never released it in front of Pinocchio, but it got me the opportunity to make other films, so that was good.
And while Frankenweenie was eventually released direct-to-video in the early 90s, Disney pretty much shelved it until it later resurfaced as an extra on the Nightmare Before Christmas Special Edition DVD in 2000. Also shelved was Tim Burton, who, in Disney's eyes, had been given 3 opportunities to make something that they could do something with. And by that point, Burton was pretty much fed up with Disney too.
It wasn't like, The Apprentice, you're fired. I didn't walk into Alan Sugar at Disney and, point the finger and do that. It was a bit more, Disney friendly. It's like, here, let Goofy and Minnie show you. Look at, there's a nice, beautiful exit with little cherubs on it.
What Tim didn't realize was that while Frankenweenie had been buried away from the public, it had also made its way around other Hollywood creatives. Creatives like comedian Paul Reubens, who was working with Warner Brothers to bring his character of Pee Wee Herman to the big screen. Both the studio and Reubens felt like Burton's dark creativity were exactly what they were looking for and, unlike Disney, knew exactly what to do with him.
I screened Frankenweenie. After about the first minute of it, I thought, this is the guy. This guy, really is, perfect in so many ways. And we went back to Warner Brothers and we said, we got it, Tim Burton. And they looked at us and went, Tim will never do this movie, never. We've sent him probably 8 projects already, and he's turned every single one of them down. He won't even read your script. And my manager, I don't know how this happened to this day, but my manager somehow got the script to Tim within a day or two of that meeting. And to Warner Brothers' incredible shock and surprise, Tim read the script right away and agreed to do the movie. Called Warner Brothers and went, I'll do it. This is my feature debut. I'll do it.
It turns out they were right, with Pee-wee's Big Adventure becoming the surprise hit of 1985. And this relationship between Warner and Burton continued to be a massive mainstream success, with 1988's Beetlejuice, 1989's Batman, and 1992's Batman Returns. In between all of that, Tim even returned to the concept of a dark fantasy fairy tale with 1990's Edward Scissorhands. And once again, we saw the story of a misunderstood outcast trying to make his way through a hyper-realistic version of American suburbia, all taking inspiration from classic Universal horror movies. And not so surprising at this point, this too became a box office success. And it was around this time that, you know who came calling. After a recent corporate reshuffling, Disney once again found themselves interested in the Tim Burton business. It had been well over a decade since Tim began his career at Disney, and after time and time again being told that he and his creativity just didn't fit within the walls of the House of Mouse, the studio was now offering him whatever he wanted to do whatever he wanted. That whatever ended up being 1993's The Nightmare Before Christmas, which was based on a short story and poem he had written towards the end of working on Hansel and Gretel. And while much of Burton's attention was on his other projects during its production, he still made sure to surround Nightmare with a comfort zone of like-minded outcasts. Like director, fellow CalArts classmate, and Disney animator Henry Selick, musician and frequent collaborator Danny Elfman, and even a bit of voice work by Pee-wee himself, Paul Reubens, among many, many others. And even though Nightmare Before Christmas had its own share of challenges when it was eventually released,
they had no idea what to do with it. The preview was a disaster. And I remember being in the elevator and the producer and some of the executives going, well, kids hate it.
Tim Burton's on and off relationship with Disney would continue with films such as Ed Wood, Alice in Wonderland, and even a fully realized stop-motion animated version of Frankenweenie, all until his 2019 reimaging of Dumbo. The less we say about this one, the better. Though right after he was done with Dumbo, Tim Burton made one more big announcement.
I'm always amazed at how certain images freak out adults when in fact it was something that was very much a part of probably their childhood and every other. And that's what fairy tales I always felt did for me, is that they're quite frightening, abstract stories, and children relate to them because it represents the abstract of life and how how am I going to deal with something I don't really understand, and all these weird, horrible images that are, I think, crucial to childhood, and yet I think people kind of forget. Some people forget as they get older.
Tim Burton was far from the only visionary to be chewed up and spit out by the House of Mouse. Check out my video here to see how things ended between Disney and Jim Henson, but you might want to make sure you have a couple of tissues on hand first. It's some pretty sad stuff.